I've camped for years and thought I'd seen everything the woods had to offer. Until last month, when I joined some friends at an old site deep in the Adirondacks. I still can't fully process what happened, and part of me wonders if I ever will. Our spot was miles off the main road, a spot that hadn't seen a camper in years. After setting up camp and a few bottles of beer, we got rid of the tension that hung over us. Around midnight, Max, one of my friends, challenged us to a night hike. I didn't want to go, but they all insisted, saying it was just to the ridge nearby and back. When you're with friends, it's hard to say no, so I forced a smile and joined them, taking a flashlight and walking in the back. The first part of the hike was uneventful, but as we ventured farther, the air grew colder. Silence settled over the forest, a deep, unnatural quiet that made it feel like we'd crossed into some strange pocket of the world. Then, just as we reached the ridge, the wind picked up. Only it wasn't a breeze. It was like something was moving around us, breathing in slow, deliberate gusts. We froze, instinctively huddling to each other. Then we heard it, a sound, a low, echoing hum, like someone whispering words we couldn't quite make out. The voice felt close, but every time I tried to pinpoint where it was coming from, it seemed to shift, moving from one side of the trail to the other. Max tried to laugh it off, saying it was just the wind, but his voice shook. We decided to head back to camp, none of us speaking, moving quickly and checking over our shoulders constantly. I kept feeling like someone was right behind us, close enough to touch, but when I looked, all I saw were those twisted trees, watching us with an intensity one could feel. About halfway back, a branch snapped loudly just off the trail, stopping us in our tracks. My friend Jenna gasped, clutching my arm as we all turned our flashlights in the direction of the sound. The beam hit something that froze my blood, a figure hunched and shrouded in shadows. It had the rough shape of a person, but it was distorted, wrong. Its arms were too long, its head bent at an odd angle, and its eyes glowed, faintly reflecting the light like a cat's. But they weren't animal eyes. The figure didn't move, but I could feel it studying us, and with each passing second, the air grew thicker, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Jenna whispered, "What is that?" But none of us could answer. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the figure slipped back into the shadows. We didn't wait. We took off running, not caring about the trail, just desperate to get back to camp. By the time we saw the faint glow of our dying fire, I could barely feel my legs, and my heart was pounding like it would burst out of my chest. Back at camp, we tried to talk about what we'd seen to make sense of it, but every explanation fell flat. It wasn't an animal, and it wasn't a person, at least not anymore. Those eyes had looked right at us. None of us slept that night, every creak and snap in the forest outside putting us on edge. It felt like the trees themselves were closing in, shifting closer with every whisper of the wind, almost as if they were shielding us or trapping us. Around 3 in the morning, we heard a scraping noise just outside the tent. Jenna's hand found mine in the dark, her fingers trembling as she whispered, "Did you hear that?" I nodded, barely breathing, as the sound circled our camp. The scraping turned into a soft, rhythmic tapping against the nylon of our tent, like someone or something was trailing a stick along the fabric. Max muttered, "Probably a raccoon," but his voice cracked, betraying the fear he was trying to hide. We all knew no animal would circle a tent like that so methodically. I reached for my flashlight, clutching it like a lifeline, and clicked it on, shining it toward the tent wall where I'd heard the tapping. The light illuminated a faint shadow, tall, hunched, and still, with long branch-like arms stretching down to the ground. We held our breaths, waiting. It didn't move. For a few agonizing seconds, we thought it might be a trick of the light, but then it bent forward, pressing closer. The shape seemed to ripple, shifting in and out of focus, like it was barely part of this world. A thin, twisted finger poked against the tent wall, drawing slow, deliberate circles. Then it started to hum. The sound was barely audible at first, a soft, monotonous hum that seeped into our heads, tugging at something primal. The pitch rose and fell, rhythmic and relentless, filling the silence between us and the creature outside. It was the same hum we'd heard on the ridge, but this time it was right there, so close I felt it buzzing in my teeth. Jenna stifled a sob, her hand tight around my wrist, while Max sat completely still, staring at the tent wall as if willing it to keep us safe. I don't know how long it hummed. Time felt strange, stretching out, twisting, as that sound rooted itself in my mind. I was just about to break, to scream or tear open the tent and make a run for it, when it stopped. For a long time, we sat in silence, not daring to move. I shone my flashlight around the inside of the tent, hoping for some sign it was gone, but dread pooled in my stomach. Somehow, the silence felt worse. Max finally unzipped the tent just a crack and peeked out. He let out a sharp breath. "There's nothing. I think it's gone." We waited until dawn before emerging. As the first gray light touched the clearing, I noticed strange marks all around our tent. They looked like symbols, crudely carved into the ground with jagged lines and looping spirals. The same shape over and over, scattered in an eerie, almost deliberate pattern. It wasn't a familiar symbol, nothing any of us had seen before. The looping spirals and broken lines were unlike any animal tracks or human patterns. In fact, they didn't resemble anything natural. Each one was etched deep into the dirt, as if something with incredible focus had carefully scraped them while we slept. A sudden wave of dread crept over me, whispering a thought I tried to brush away. But the feeling wouldn't let go, like it was sinking deeper into my bones. The symbols looked like they were there to keep something contained, or keep something out. Max hurriedly kicked dirt over them, but Jenna stopped him, pulling him back. "I don't think we should mess with them," she said, her voice low and tight with fear. She hadn't stopped trembling since the night before, and I couldn't blame her. I wasn't much better. Something had come to our campsite, circled us, left these strange markers, and then slipped back into the forest, leaving us untouched. For now, we packed in silence, each of us glancing over our shoulders as we loaded our bags, as if expecting to see that tall, hunched figure watching from the trees. I felt it too, that unnerving sensation of being studied, like the forest itself had eyes. By the time we'd packed everything up and were hiking back to the car, the sun had fully risen. But somehow, even in daylight, the shadows felt longer, colder. The drive home should have felt like relief, but it didn't. Each of us was wrapped in silence, the kind that comes from knowing something unspeakable and having no words to say it. I couldn't get that humming sound out of my mind, its low and monotonous drone echoing even above the roar of the engine. Every time I thought it had faded, it would creep back in, low and relentless, as if it had become part of me. Halfway back, Jenna broke the silence. "Do you think it'll follow us?" she whispered. Her voice sounded almost childish, like she was afraid to say the words too loudly. I didn't have an answer, and neither did Max. The figure in the woods, that strange, deliberate hum, it hadn't felt like a random encounter. It had felt intentional. Max gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white, and muttered, "Maybe we should just forget it ever happened. Act like we never even saw it." But even as he said it, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. There are some things you can't just forget. I could feel that hum vibrating through my skull, feel those watching eyes somewhere behind us, lurking in the memory of last night's twisted shadows. Over the next few weeks, the forest stayed with me. I thought I'd be able to shake it, to leave whatever had happened back at the campsite, but it followed me like a shadow. I started having nightmares, Dreams where I'd wake up back in that clearing, the symbols surrounding me, glowing faintly, as if lit from underneath. In the dreams, the humming was louder, sharper, almost melodic, weaving its way through my mind until it felt like it was coming from inside me. Sometimes, I'd hear scratching at my window at night. I tried to tell myself it was just branches or maybe raccoons, but I'd lie there, paralyzed, the sound dragging along the glass with that same slow, calculated rhythm I'd heard on the tent that night. The dreams became more frequent, and I found myself slipping into exhaustion, unable to escape that dark, twisting forest even when I was home. One night, I woke up drenched in sweat, the hum ringing through my head so clearly that I thought it was coming from outside my door. I stumbled out of bed, heart pounding, and when I looked out my window, my blood ran cold. There, on the other side of the street, just under the streetlight, stood a figure. Tall, twisted, its head bent at an unnatural angle. Its eyes caught the light, glinting faintly in that same, disturbing way I remembered. But it didn't move. It just stood there, watching, a dark smudge against the hazy glow of the streetlight. I blinked, and it was gone, leaving only the silence and that lingering, throbbing hum that I was beginning to fear would haunt me forever. Days passed, and I tried to convince myself it had all been a hallucination, a trick of my sleep-deprived mind. I avoided talking about it with Max and Jenna. We texted briefly after the trip, but they didn't seem eager to discuss it either. We were all trying to bury it in our own ways. But then, strange things started happening around my house. One morning, I stepped outside to find the symbols etched into the dirt in my backyard. The same crude spirals and jagged lines, forming a loose ring around my porch. I stood there, staring down at them, my skin prickling as a faint hum started up in my ears again. The symbols hadn't been there the night before, I was certain of it. I'd been outside at dusk, looking around my yard for any sign of that figure, half expecting to see it watching from the shadows. But the yard had been empty. I didn't tell anyone about the symbols, not even my friends. Somehow, I felt like speaking about them would make them more real, would give whatever was happening more power. Instead, I tried to ignore them, but that night, the humming grew louder, filling my head like a dull, persistent ache. I barely slept, and when I did, my dreams were darker than ever, filled with twisted trees and glowing eyes. Over the following days, I became a shadow of myself, barely able to think or focus. My friends noticed, but I shrugged it off, telling them it was just work stress. I could tell Jenna and Max were going through something similar. Jenna looked exhausted, and Max had grown uncharacteristically quiet. We were all haunted in our own ways, trying to pretend like life was normal when, deep down, we knew it wasn't. One night, Jenna called me, her voice barely more than a whisper. "They're in my house," she said. I could hear the tremor in her voice, the sound of someone who hadn't slept in days. "What do you mean?" I wanted to comfort her, to tell her it would be okay, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. If the symbols were finding their way inside her home, then maybe they would come for me next. Desperate, we met up again, each of us more frightened than we'd been willing to admit. We shared stories of our nightmares, the symbols that had started appearing in our homes, and the strange, echoing hum that seemed to follow us everywhere. We couldn't keep pretending it was all in our heads. Something from that forest had latched onto us, and it wasn't letting go. Jenna suggested we find the ranger we'd spoken to before our camping trip. Maybe he knew something, anything that could help. We all agreed, and the next day we drove back to the ranger station. The ranger looked different this time, more tired, as if he'd been waiting for us. When we explained what was happening, he didn't seem surprised. Instead, he nodded slowly, as if he'd heard it all before. There are spirits in those woods, he said quietly. Not all of them are friendly, and some of them, they don't let go so easily. He told us about a ritual, a way to appease the spirit, to show it respect, to hopefully break its hold over us. It wasn't anything complicated, but it was precise, involving specific offerings left in the clearing under the moon at midnight. We had no choice. We packed up and returned to the forest, each of us filled with a sense of dread, but a sliver of hope too. The clearing looked different this time, darker, quieter, like it had been waiting for us. We placed the offerings carefully, following the ranger's instructions, and stood back, waiting. The hum returned, louder than ever, filling the clearing with a heavy, suffocating presence. I could feel it watching, feel its anger and its hunger. For a moment, I thought it might take us right then and there. But then, just as suddenly, the hum faded. The forest felt lighter, as if something had lifted. The symbols seemed to lose their power, and for the first time, I felt like we might be free. It's been months since that night. The symbols haven't returned, and the hum is gone from my mind. But I can't shake the feeling that the spirit is still out there, waiting, lurking in the shadows of those ancient woods, watching for the next person foolish enough to stumble into its territory.